50 million. 50 million human beings will perish during the course of World War II. More than half will be civilians. The generation that went through this war, the generation that went through the Holocaust, the generation that went through the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain, the generation that went through Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the generation that went through this entire period of history is all but gone. If you were 20 years old when World War II began, now you're in your late 90s. And as that generation passes, people are already forgetting. They're forgetting what happened during the Holocaust. They're forgetting about all the major events of the war. And so what we're going to be doing over the next long period of lectures here, I'm not sure exactly how long this is going to take through this format, but we are going to cover quite a bit of World War II. And we're going to go through, obviously, the causes of World War II, and you will need to know the causes. You will need to know the causes. You will need to know the causes. You need to know the causes in Europe and the causes in the Pacific, and so we'll cover both. And then, of course, after we go through the causes of World War II, then we'll get through the battles themselves. When I lectured on World War I, I talked a lot about trench warfare, but I didn't describe to you specific battles very much. In this case, we're going to talk about a few of the battles, and you're going to see how dark and how dangerous things really got during the World War II years during this period of time. And then finally, we get into the end of the war and how the war comes to an end. And it is very important you know this information, because the reality is you are the last generation, right? If you stop and you think about it, you are the last generation from people who will have a chance to hear directly from World War II survivors or Holocaust survivors, because your kids will never have that opportunity. So now more than ever, you need to know this information, because your children will never be able to meet a World War II vet one day and say, hey, what happened? Or somebody who lived through World War II and say, hey, what happened? So you're it. So that's very important as well as we go through this topic. I really do wish we could do this in person. This is one of those lectures that it makes a lot more sense to do in person, in class, and as much as we try to recreate this, you just can't, but we're going to do our best with this. So let's start with the causes. And some of the causes of World War II go back a while, right? Obviously, when we think of World War II, it begins in 1939. The events leading up to World War II go back much earlier. So we're going to start with Europe, and then we'll get into eventually the Pacific a little bit later. So one of the causes of World War II is, of course, World War I, right? And it's not enough to say, well, World War I is a cause of World War II. You have to explain how World War I is a cause of World War II. So if you remember, during World War I, Germany was defeated. And of course, after the defeat, you had the Treaty of Versailles. Now, World War I, it wasn't that simple. That's just the Treaty of Versailles. World War I was a devastating war across the continent. France, England, all these countries that were involved were devastated by the war. And what that war did is it really made people a generation later worry about standing up to Hitler, standing up to Mussolini. And so in some respects, World War I is what made a lot of Europe very hesitant to deal with somebody like Hitler later on. There was, of course, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles was written, we discussed this in our previous lecture, and how it has this kind of perception that the Treaty of Versailles caused World War II. Let me read you something here. This is in 1923. It says, with this armistice, referring to the Treaty of Versailles, begins the humiliation of Germany. So long as this treaty stands, there could be no resurrection of the German people. No social reform of any kind is possible. The treaty was made in order to bring 20 million Germans to their death and ruin the German nation. Now, that was Hitler in 1923. Is any of that accurate? Well, of course not. The Treaty of Versailles was not meant to bring 20 million Germans to their death. But what you see Hitler is doing very early is he's using the Treaty of Versailles to make the people in Germany feel like victims. This is something very common we see with these totalitarian rulers, to try to make their people feel victimized. We talked about this the first day of class, right? You want to be miserable your whole life, think yourself a victim. And when you're miserable in that respect, then Hitler could use that to gain traction and gain power, which of course we know in our last lecture on totalitarianism, he will eventually rise to power in Germany. So he will use that treaty itself. So that's going to be a factor. factor. And you have to be kind of clear, explain. It's not just the treaty, it's how Hitler uses the Treaty of Versailles. So you have World War I, that's a cause. You have the Treaty of Versailles, that's a bit of a cause. You also have, of course, the restoration of German power. One of the things we all know about Hitler is he was a monster of great proportions in human history. But we also know that during the time Hitler came to power, he restored German strength, restored the industrial complex, and restored the military complex. If that doesn't happen, you never have World War II. Remember, think back to World War I. One of the causes of World War I was a strong Germany in the central part of Europe. Well, now you have that again. This time it's under Hitler's rule, a strong Germany in the central part of Europe. So that's going to be a factor. Another cause of the rise of World War II, of course, that I didn't lecture on, but you were supposed to read in your textbook, and make sure you do read the information in your textbook on this, and that's Mussolini. Most people know that during World War II, eventually Mussolini and Hitler will form an alliance, but this is also something that's going to help trigger World War II. So those are things we've kind of touched upon or in your readings. Now, there is another major cause of World War II that I want to spend a little bit more time on. And this cause of World War II is that of appeasement. So let's talk about what that word means and explain examples of what it's about. So appeasement is basically allowing somebody to do something they want, and when they scream and yell about it, you don't want to deal with it, so you appease them. I've been using this example since I started to teach 23 years ago, and now it kind of applies very well in my personal life, because I've always used the example of you're at a supermarket and you have a baby with you, a 2, 3, 4-year-old child, right? And you go down the candy aisle or something, and the child sees something they want there, and the parent says, no, 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 you can't have that. And what does the child do? They throw a tantrum, and they scream and they yell, and the mom or dad just wants the kid to be quiet, so here's your candy, stop crying. What did that child who just threw a tantrum learn? He learned something very simple. If I scream and yell, I get what I want. And that encourages them to scream and yell even more. And so what happens with appeasement is Hitler's going to do a whole bunch of things, and Europe is going to appease him. Europe, the United States, the world is going to appease him. Now, there are a lot of examples of appeasement, right? From 1932 all the way till 1939. We're going to go through quite a few of them. How many of these do you want to know? Well, all of them, right? And so every example I give you, you would want to know as key things of appeasement. Also, of course, on a basic level, when you talk about how World War II starts, Hitler, right? If you don't have Hitler coming to power, you never have World War II. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start going through our different examples of appeasement, really starting from 1932. And in 1932, Hitler comes to power. Now, how does Europe react to it? They basically do nothing. And you go, well, all right, well, what should they do? Well, that's something. Remember, at this point, he'd already written Mein Kampf. He'd already given a number of speeches. And we talked about this in the audio lecture last time, that the significance of Mein Kampf is no one can claim ignorance. No one can say to Hitler, oh, we didn't know what you were going to do. And so he told everyone, and yet despite knowing that, people were still willing to accept him as the new leader of Germany. He was just one of the other rulers of Europe at the time. So they didn't do much about him when he comes into power. 1934, a couple things are going to start happening here that are a little bit more interesting. One of which is Hitler's going to openly talk about annexing Austria. So let me kind of just step aside. I want you to look at this map, and you're going to want to look at this map in your book as well, because I'm going to talk about it, and then you're going to see it again, and I'm going to make references to it. So you may want to pause the video, look at the map, and then you may have to kind of come back to this video every time I talk about the map to get a visual of what's going on, right? So here's just kind of this map of Europe that we're talking about in terms of the events leading up to the war, okay? All right, so there's the map, and one of the areas you see where Austria is, and Hitler was, of course, born in Austria, and so what's going to end up happening is Hitler's going to say, I want Austria. Well, he doesn't take over Austria in 1934. Interestingly enough, one person that was against it was Mussolini, because Mussolini was still not, sure what was going on with Hitler, and so he's like, no, don't do this, and Hitler wasn't quite strong enough to do much, and he kind of backed off a little bit. But just the fact he talked about it, and the rest of Europe really didn't do anything, shows that Europe is not showing any sort of concern about what Hitler is doing. We get to 1935. 1935 is a big year in appeasement. So let me run through a few things. One of the things that's going to happen in 1935 is Hitler will form an alliance with Italy and Mussolini. So now if you look at our map and you remember what the map looks like, again, you already know he wants Austria. He's going to ally with Italy. That's going to, of course, cut Europe in half. And that's, from a strategic point, very significant. What happens when he allies with Mussolini, an openly known fascist? Again, Europe does nothing. In 1935, Hitler is also going to publicly announce he's creating an air force. Now, you go, what's the big deal? Well, if you remember the Treaty of Versailles, he was not allowed to create an air force, yet he's going to. He violates the Treaty of Versailles. And, again, keeping in mind, he'd already written Mein Kampf, he's already talked about all these horrible things he wants to do, he's building up his air force, and what do the European powers do? Nothing. They appease him. Also in 1935, he publicly announces he's creating an army of 500,000 men. Again, 500,000 men, a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. It's going to get a lot larger than that by the time the war breaks out. And again, European powers in the United States do nothing. Also in 1935, he's going to sign an agreement with England known as the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. And this Anglo-German Naval Agreement is going to allow Hitler to build up a bigger navy. So that's going to happen in 1935 as well. And one more thing in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws. And the Nuremberg Laws, for those of you who aren't familiar with those, were a series of laws passed in Germany in 1935 that really were an indication of what Hitler was planning in the future. The Nuremberg Laws were specifically targeted towards the Jewish population. There were laws, for example, that took citizenship away from Jewish people who lived in Germany. They lived in Germany their whole life. They were legally German citizens forever. And Hitler said, well, no more. If you're Jewish, you're no longer a citizen. Other ones of these laws prohibited Jews from certain professions and from Jewish people to hold bank accounts, all these very restrictive laws to life. And publicly, everybody knew about this. And again, Europe and the United States did nothing. Now, I also want to be clear. The opposite of appeasement does not mean war. It doesn't mean your options are, it's not a binary thing where it's either we let Hitler conquer the world or we fight a massive war. There are things you could do in between. The problem is this with appeasement. The longer you wait, your options are smaller. The stronger Hitler gets, the more difficult it is to deal with him. It would have been fairly easy to deal with Hitler in 1932. It's a lot harder now in 1935 when he's building up his military, and it's going to be a heck of a lot harder by the time we get to 1937, 38, 39, right? And then by the time anybody decides to do something, it's too late. He's already got all the momentum. So that's an important point to keep in mind about this appeasement idea. So 1935, not a good year for this events going on in Europe. 1936. In 1936, Hitler is going to do something even more dramatic than 1935. He's going to move his growing military forces into the Rhineland. And so if you remember on the map, I think I'll just step aside again and pop up the map one more time here. Right, same map. And you can see the Rhineland area, that shaded area there, okay? And so that shaded area of the Rhineland region, that region, remember, was demilitarized. That was the land that was supposed to be, part of Germany, but no troops there. He moves troops into the Rhineland. What happens? Who should worry? Well, one country should worry quite a bit at this point is France, right? If you stop and you think about it, France was the border. The reason that was there is because they were worried about a potential German attack. And France mumbles and grumbles a bit, but nothing happens. Now, I found this quote later on from Hitler about his movement into the Rhineland. And I want you to listen to this very carefully. This is what he says. He says the 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking in my life. If the French had marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs, for the military resources at our disposal would have been wholly inadequate for even a moderate resistance. Why don't you let that sink in, right? Maybe listen to that again. What Hitler is saying there is that if the French did something, he would have backed off because his forces were not quite that strong yet. And if you think about the ramifications, that means we could have fought a war with Hitler in 1936. Some people would have died, but Hitler probably would have been stopped right there and then, and we never have World War II. 50 million people don't die. The Holocaust doesn't happen, right? And so that's pretty mind-blowing if you think about it, but that's the appeasement, right? So that was 1936. All right, not only does the Europeans do nothing in 1936, another example of appeasement in 1936 was the Olympic Games. And the Olympic Games were actually held in Germany in 1936, and countries went. Now, I also want to be clear, there were people who opposed the appeasement policy. The problem is the people who opposed the appeasement policy were not the people in charge, right? The people in charge were perfectly fine accepting everything Hitler did. There were individuals. One of the more interesting stories during the 1936 Olympic Games that were held in Germany, in Berlin, there were Jewish American athletes, for example, like a man named Milton Green. He said, I'm not going to Germany, right? I'm not going to go support a man who speaks of this, of Jewish people. And so there were individuals, but as a whole, most people didn't object or anything to the fact that the Olympic Games were in this country with a man like Hitler had written Mein Kampf, built up the military, issued the Nuremberg laws, and all these things we've already talked about. The only good thing from that 36 Olympic Games, of course, is the Jesse Owens story. If you're not familiar with that, that's a great American story of this track athlete. Of course, Jesse Owens black. He ran these races. Hitler was certain that his white, super race and all that were going to win. And Jesse Owens wins every race, and Hitler gets all pissed off. So, that's always good when Hitler gets pissed off. But other than that, really, this was kind of symbolic of just the understanding of what's going on, the being oblivious to what Hitler was doing. All right, we move ahead. 1937 to 1939. Not good at all, because in this year's Hitler's going to be even more aggressive. He's going to conquer Austria. He annexes Austria now. So if you remember in the map, he does annex Austria. And he's also going to annex, in then 1938 into 1939, we're going to get, this is all 1938, then we'll talk about 1939, but 1938, he's going to move into what is called the Sudetenland. Now, the Sudetenland, if you look back at your map, is this little sliver of land that's in Czechoslovakia, right? And it's kind of this border between Germany and Czechoslovakia, and Hitler moves into that. Now, the difference between Austria and the Sudetenland, a lot of people in Austria liked Hitler. People in Czechoslovakia did not want Hitler there, and they were really upset when Hitler moved into the Sudetenland in 1938. And so much so that they were like, what's going on here? You can't do this, and this is too much. It's just you can't move into another country. And at this point, the Prime Minister of England at the time was a man named Neville Chamberlain. And Neville Chamberlain, at this point, who was a guy who favored appeasement, was like, all right, maybe Hitler, you're going a little bit too far. You can't really be moving into other areas. And so, England is the strongest nation in the world, really, at the time. Maybe, probably even stronger than the U.S. at this point. Remember, the British still had this empire everywhere. And so, either England or the United States, two of the most powerful countries. So what happens is Hitler knows Chamberlain's upset. What does Hitler do? Hitler tells Chamberlain, let's talk about it. And he invites Chamberlain to Munich. And so there's this, what is called the Munich Conference, September 1938. And in this Munich conference, what Hitler does is he tells Chamberlain, hey, Neville, I'm going to be good, right? Let me take over the Sudetenland, and I promise, if you let me take over the Sudetenland, I won't take over any more land. And so that was this idea that he puts in 1938. Chamberlain hears that idea, and what ends up happening, my phone was ringing in the background, sorry about that. And so back to Chamberlain. So Chamberlain, 1938, he hears this idea. Hitler promises he won't take over any more land, and at that point, Neville Chamberlain says, okay. In fact, there's a very famous photo. I want you to see this photo right here. And this is a photo of Neville Chamberlain with Hitler's signature on it, a piece of paper with Hitler's signature. And what is, of course, that famous photo that you just saw there? It's Neville Chamberlain coming back from Munich with a signature with Hitler's signature on this piece of paper, announcing to the world, I have achieved peace for our time. Well, of course, Neville Chamberlain has gone down as one of the biggest idiots in history. After Mein Kampf, after, the Nuremberg, after building up the army, after moving into Austria, after all that, the idea that Neville Chamberlain actually believed Hitler is astonishing. And you go, well, okay, well, hindsight's 20/20. It's easy for us to now say, oh man, that was a mistake, right? Again, there were many people at the time who looked at the Munich conference and said, what are you doing, Neville Chamberlain, right? But those people were not in power in 1938. So he keeps the Sudetenland, and not only does Hitler keep the Sudetenland, he will then move in and conquer much of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And again, nothing happens. So by the time we get to 1938 into early 1939, Hitler's got obviously Germany, he's allied with Italy, he's got Austria, and he's already moved to Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, and World War II still has not begun. Here's another really good image of a political cartoon I want you to see. So if you kind of just look at this political cartoon, and if you go through it, what you see on that political cartoon, you may need to zoom in, is a man named David Lowe, and he's kind of showing, it says the spineless leaders of democracy, and Hitler's like thumbing his nose, walking all over him, and over each one there's a word like Rhineland fortification and militarization, and it's basically, then you guys see the question marks, and exclamation points. In other words, what's he going to do next? What's he going to do next? And at the very end, I don't know if you could see it, but at the very end it says boss of the universe. So there were people who realized this. Here's another image I want to show you, and this is an image of a boycott Nazi Germany image, right? And so there you see people willing to boycott Nazi Germany. Sadly, there were even pro-Nazi Germany rallies in the U.S. That image was from the United States, Madison Square Garden, and there were people who supported even Germany in the United States. This was not a good time in U.S. history there were some people who supported him, believe it or not. So that wasn't good. But at the end of the day, there were many people who spoke up against Hitler. They were not the ones in power. So whether it was any of these political cartoonists or average people or athletes, again, no. And then there were politicians who were against appeasement, but again, they weren't the ones in office. All right, so all of that is part of appeasement. Very important. Make sure you know all of those examples in terms of why World War II happened. All right, there's one more cause of World War II in Europe before we get into the start of the war. And the other cause of World War II, other than appeasement, is what is called the Non-Aggression Pact. Because one of the things Hitler does do before he officially launches what will eventually cause the World War II, his movement into Poland, is he goes to Stalin. And he makes a deal with Stalin, with Russia. It's called the Non-Aggression Pact. And in this deal, he basically tells Stalin, hey, I got an idea. You don't attack me, I don't attack you, non-aggression pact. I take over Western Poland, you'll take over Eastern Poland, and we don't attack each other. Now, why is this a cause of World War II? Well, this was a very smart strategic move on the part of Hitler. Remember World War I, Germany had to fight a two-front war, and as a result of Germany having to fight a two-front war, what that means was it was very hard for them. And by signing this non-aggression pact, Hitler knows he can move into somewhere like Poland and other parts of Europe and not have to worry about an invasion from Russia. And once he does that in 1939, this non-aggression pact, I believe that was August of 1939, that now opens the door for Hitler to move into Poland, which he's going to do in September of 1939. And once he moves into Poland in September of 1939, then and only then do the European powers declare war against Hitler. The United States does not. We'll get into that in a second. But that's when World War II begins, September 1939. But by the time we get to that, again, Hitler's got a massive army. He's already moved in. He's already got Austria. He's got this alliance with Mussolini. He's also got an alliance with Japan by now, right? Which we've talked about is very imperialistic and powerful. So it's not very good when the war begins. All right, so the war starts, and there are two major sides to the war, of course. What do we call the Allies and the Axis powers? The Axis powers will be Japan and Italy and Germany, right? Those are the three Axis powers. And the Allies are really just basically going to be France and England. You go, what about the rest of Europe? Well, as you're going to see, the rest of Europe is not going to last very long once the war begins. What about the U.S.? Well, when World War II begins, the United States is officially neutral. The U.S. did, of course, want England and France to win, but they weren't ready to be involved in another war. And so the U.S. tried a couple things. When the war began, the U.S. said, well, we're neutral and we'll trade with anybody provided we pass what is called a cash and carry policy, which was specifically designed to help England. Why? Because England had more resources, had more money, had more ships, and so the cash and carry policy would help them a lot more than excuse me, help them a lot more than Germany. And so it's kind of a wink and a nod. Yeah, we're neutral, we'll trade with anybody, but it's really helping England a bit more. As the war went on, then you're going to get to what is called the Lend-Lease Act. And the Lend-Lease Act was when the United States basically declared to Germany that, or to the world really, that we are going to lend lease. We're going to give whatever England needs to fight the war. So the cash carry was at the start of the war. Lend-Lease Act is not going to be till 1941, March of 1941. By now the war has gone really poorly, as we're going to see in a moment. And the U.S. basically told England, we'll lend you, we'll lease you whatever you need to fight the war, and then, you can pay us back later on whenever you can with whatever you want. It was basically a blank check to England, what do you need to fight the war? But that was a couple years into the war now, and things are really bad. And at the end of the day, that might help, but by 1941, what England and Europe is going to really need is American troops, and that's still in March 1941 not happening. All right, so now let's get into the actual warfare, right? So I want to kind of get into the war itself here. Let me just grab some water. And we'll get to the actual war. All right, so when we talk about the war itself, I want to again look at our new map here. So this is a new map of the World War II period. So kind of take a look at this map. I'll make some reference to it in a bit. And so let's talk about what happens during the war and how the war gets going and how the war begins. So I guess we'll start with a very important World War II term, blitzkrieg. Lightning war. All right, so let's talk about lightning war and what all this means and how this relates to the war. All right, so let's kind of pause here for a second, and then we'll kind of continue on with the war itself in our next segment.